a mentally unstable mother, and a father with dissociative amnesia. Who do you think is capable of wiping out an entire family? Brace yourself, because this chilling case will have you questioning everything. Even some of the investigators weren't fully convinced that the man convicted of the murders was the one who actually killed the family, and this has sparked a major debate that still rages on today. So, once again, we're diving deep into the case to analyze. Was he truly innocent? Or is he just a master at pretending to be one? For starters, the Vaughn family was what you'd picture as the perfect American family, a family of 5 that everyone thought had it all together. They were even featured in a local newspaper with this seemingly carefree photo that quickly went viral. In this picture, we see Kimberly Phillips and Christopher Vaughn, a couple who had been together for over a decade, raising 3 children. To the outside world, they seemed like the perfect, happy, and close-knit family. But little did anyone know, their seemingly perfect life was about to take a dark and tragic twist that would shake everything to its core. Kimberly, born in December 1972 in St. Charles, Missouri, grew up in a well-to-do family with 2 sisters, Jennifer and Elizabeth. Interestingly, Jennifer was Kimberly's twin, and Kimberly's family placed a strong emphasis on education and personal development. In fact, she attended a prestigious school, was active in sports, and was known for her friendly, open, and sociable nature. On the flip side, we've got Christopher Vaughn, born in September 1974 in St. Louis, Missouri. He grew up in a humble, tight-knit family with 2 brothers. As a kid, he was all about soccer, hiking, camping, and spending time with his family outdoors. These little details might seem random now, but trust me, they'll play a big role later when it comes to piecing together the mystery of what really happened. According to sources, Kimberly and Christopher met in the early 1990s, and it didn't take long for them to fall head over heels for each other. But not everyone was on board with their love story, especially Kimberly's parents. They didn't approve, citing Christopher's age, lack of a stable job, and his less than affluent background. But Kimberly and Christopher weren't about to let anyone stand in their way. They were determined to make it work, and not long after, Kimberly found out she was pregnant. In the summer of 1994, they tied the knot. Christopher was still a teenager, not yet 20, while Kimberly was just a little older. Despite their youth, they were ready to start a family. Their first child, Abigail, was born just 4 months after the wedding in October of 1994. A year later, their second daughter, Cassandra, arrived, and 3 years after that, their son Blake completed the family. The early years of their marriage were filled with love and laughter as they built their life together. The kids were talented and creative, excelling in sports and music. Kimberly was a devoted homemaker, always involved in her children's lives, serving as the head of the PTA and leading their scout troop. Meanwhile, Christopher was building up a small cybersecurity business. After a few years, the family made a big move to Washington State, and by the early 2000s, they settled into a quiet town in Illinois, where they bought a big house. This was the time the family was featured in a newspaper for how beautifully they had decorated their home. Now, Kimberly was eager to take on something new, so she decided to go after a law degree. She enrolled in a local university, and just a month before the tragedy struck, she earned her law degree. From the outside, their family seemed like the perfect picture of the American dream, right? So, if you're wondering what went wrong, well, it turns out that Christopher's job often took him away from home, and during those trips, he began an affair with a woman named Jill. This affair went on for about a year before Kimberly found out, and it rocked their marriage to its core. Even though Christopher had betrayed her, they chose to stay together, mainly for the kids. But the cracks in their relationship only deepened. Kimberly couldn't shake the feeling that Christopher was still cheating on her, and as it turned out, she wasn't wrong. As if all the emotional stress wasn't enough, Kimberly's health started to suffer too. She began battling severe anxiety, constant migraines, insomnia, and even high blood pressure. It was a lot to handle, and she had no choice but to see a doctor. The medication she was prescribed became a regular part of her life, and for about a year, she did her best to manage it all. Additionally, Kimberly attended sessions with a psychologist where she opened up about the growing issues in her marriage. Despite everything she was going through, she remained sociable, friendly, and active. On the other hand, Christopher was described by those close to him as a withdrawn introvert who rarely expressed emotion. Then came June 2007, just before their 13th wedding anniversary. The couple decided to take a family trip to an amusement park in Springfield, Illinois. Christopher picked the destination, and the rest of the family was on board with it. So, in the early morning hours of June 14th, the Vaughn family set off in their SUV. But only a few hours later, Christopher was found bloodied, wandering along the highway by a passing motorist. He had a wound on his leg and, in a calm tone, claimed that his wife had shot him. But that's where his story got strange. He couldn't recall anything more, blaming a sudden lapse in memory. According to Christopher, they had been on their way to the amusement park when Kimberly started feeling carsick and asked him to stop. He pulled over to the side of the road and stepped out to check the roof rack. That's when he said he heard a gunshot and everything went black. When he came to, he saw blood running down his leg and, in a state of shock, ran away, not knowing what had happened to his wife and children. He was picked up by a passerby and still couldn't remember where the SUV had been parked. But when the police found the vehicle, they discovered something horrific inside. Kimberly and their 3 children, all shot dead.
From the time police got to this startling scene, private investigator Bill Clutter says father and husband Christopher Vaughn was the primary suspect, accused of killing his family and staging it like a murder-suicide.
By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Kimberly had been shot once in the head, and each of the children had been shot twice. Although a witness at the scene recalled Christopher Vaughn saying his wife had pulled the trigger, Vaughn's memory seemed to betray him once he reached the hospital. In fact, when speaking to a nurse, he reportedly said, "You should call my wife. She gets mad when I don't call her." After getting treatment, Vaughn was taken to the police station, where he was grilled for almost 14 hours on June 14th. He came back for 2 more rounds of questioning on June 15th and 17th. During these lengthy interviews, he told investigators he remembered Kimberly asking him to pull over on the frontage road because she was feeling nauseous. He described how he pulled off the road, parked near a cell phone tower, and got out of the car to check the back tires. After securing the strap on the topper, he got back in the car and noticed his leg was bleeding. However, he claimed he had no memory of anyone shooting him or his family. When detectives suggested that perhaps Kimberly had shot him, Christopher immediately defended her, saying, "There was no way she could have hurt the kids." He stuck to his story, stating that he had only learned about being shot when a doctor told him at the hospital. He seemed genuinely confused, claiming that no one else was around and Kimberly didn't have a gun, so he couldn't understand how it had happened. As the questioning continued, the detectives informed him that his family wasn't dead and asked him to explain what had happened. At that point, Vaughn asked them to bring Kimberly in so he could talk to her directly. Throughout the entire process, he repeatedly denied being involved in the deaths, insisting that he had no memory of the horrific events. But soon after, he would also claim that it was Kimberly who shot him. This shift in his story only added to the confusion, making it harder to believe his version of the tragic events. Initially, many people defended Christopher, believing he couldn't possibly have committed such a horrific act. They speculated that someone else might have been involved. However, the police, who had seen the crime scene firsthand, were convinced that the murders were domestic in nature and dismissed the idea of any other suspects. During further interrogations, Christopher couldn't recall any new details but stuck to his story, insisting that Kimberly might have been the one to kill their children, wound him, and then take her own life. He attributed her actions to the medication she had been taking and the tension in their relationship due to his infidelity. He explained his memory loss by claiming it was a result of shock, which also accounted for why he hadn't immediately contacted the authorities or emergency services. Despite his unconvincing explanations, there wasn't enough evidence to arrest Christopher right away. The police continued their investigation, seizing the couple's laptops and searching the family's home. While the preliminary investigation was underway, Christopher remained free, even going so far as to organize the funeral for his wife and children. The funeral, scheduled for June 23rd, took place at a local funeral home. A large crowd gathered, and many attendees noticed the palpable tension between the Vaughn and Phillips families. Just as the funeral service was about to begin, a police car arrived, and Christopher was arrested on charges of murdering his family. He remained calm, going with the officers without resistance. However, his parents were furious, arguing that their son wasn't even allowed to say goodbye to his family. While Christopher's guilt had not been proven, the extensive media coverage of the case led the Vaughn family to believe that his arrest at the funeral was a deliberate move to garner even more public attention. Meanwhile, the Phillips family welcomed the arrest. Kimberly's mother expressed a sense of relief, saying she was glad her daughter had been cleared of suspicion in the deaths of her children. From the outset, investigators had been skeptical of Christopher's account. He consistently attributed his lack of recollection to a sudden memory lapse, all while insisting that his wife was responsible for the horrific crime. He even considered himself fortunate that the bullet had only grazed the soft tissue of his thigh, avoiding any major blood vessels. But as the investigation unfolded, it was revealed that Christopher had taken out a life insurance policy on Kimberly, one that would entitle him to a $1 million payout in the event of her death. The deeper the police dug, the more convinced they became that Christopher was the primary suspect in this terrible tragedy. The investigation spanned over 5 years, and during this time, Christopher remained in custody, despite his repeated claims of innocence. He faced a slew of serious charges, and if convicted, he could have been sentenced to death under state law. He was provided with attorneys funded by a special program offering legal defense to those facing capital punishment. Christopher's defense team worked tirelessly to shift the blame onto his late wife, Kimberly. They presented evidence suggesting that Kimberly had suffered from various mental health issues, made worse by the marital crisis caused by Christopher's infidelity and her subsequent health problems. They argued that the medication she had been prescribed only worsened her condition, ultimately leading to her tragic actions. Now, this whole thing might not be as far-fetched as it sounds, especially if you consider the perspective of Robert Deal, a crime scene investigator who worked on the case. Deal has openly supported Christopher Vaughn, arguing that the bullet's path and other forensic evidence actually point to Kimberly being the shooter. He believes that investigators had tunnel vision, only focusing on one theory without considering other possibilities. According to Deal, whenever he tried to suggest something that went against the official narrative, he wasn't taken seriously. He felt like every time he had an idea that didn't fit with what the police were saying, they just brushed him off, claiming that Christopher Vaughn was a criminal mastermind who could outsmart everyone, even the experts. Deal said, they would change their theory of what happened to try to match the evidence, instead of letting the evidence guide them to the truth. The defense team also pointed out that some key pieces of the state's forensic case didn't hold up under scrutiny. For instance, the state argued that Christopher unbuckled his wife's seatbelt after shooting her, claiming a large blood stain near the latch came from Kimberly's wound. But when DNA tests were done, it was revealed that the blood actually belonged to Christopher, not Kimberly. What's even more telling is a transfer stain found on Kimberly's right thumb, which suggests that she might have unbuckled her seatbelt after Christopher was shot. This little piece of evidence made the state's theory look pretty shaky. The defense didn't stop there. They also highlighted that at the time of her death, Kimberly was taking medications like nortriptyline and Topamax for her migraine headaches. A year after her death, the FDA released a report that showed a significant risk of suicide linked to both of these drugs. Kimberly herself had even mentioned in an email to Christopher just 2 weeks before her death that she'd noticed a big personality change and increased anxiety in herself. To make matters more complicated, her nortriptyline levels were found to be at the low end of the toxic range, suggesting that the medication might have been messing with her mood and behavior. The defense theorized that these drugs could have made her behave in ways that were out of character, potentially even leading to self-harm or homicidal thoughts. The defense also suggested that Christopher could have suffered from something called dissociative amnesia. This condition, which can happen after a person experiences something traumatic, could explain why he had no memory of the tragic events that occurred. Even Dr. Todd Grande, a professional counselor who specializes in personality disorders, addiction, trauma recovery, psychopathology, and assessments, pointed out that cases like this aren't exactly rare. According to him, it's actually possible for people to lose their memory following a specific traumatic event, like an accident.
The argument of the defense was that Chris had memory loss, and it could be explained by a disorder called dissociative amnesia. This is a type of amnesia that can occur around the events of a trauma. I've seen this many times. I don't have any doubt that it's a real condition. For example, it happens once in a while with severe motor vehicle accidents. The argument of the defense was that Chris had memory loss, and it could be explained by a disorder called dissociative amnesia.
This kind of memory loss, known as dissociative amnesia, can occur when someone goes through something so traumatic that their mind essentially blocks out the event to protect them from the emotional pain. So, while it might seem unusual, it's not completely unheard of for someone to forget details of a major incident, especially when it's tied to trauma. At this point, things were finally starting to look up for Christopher in his case, but just as hope seemed to be on his side, a big change occurred. The state passed new laws that abolished the death penalty. This meant Christopher lost the legal team that had been funded by the Capital Defense Program. His defense team asked for a hefty $250,000 to continue their work, but Christopher simply couldn't afford it. As a result, he was given a public defender, and they had to start from scratch, completely reworking his defense. Unfortunately for Christopher, this new defense team couldn't make a strong case, and things took a turn when investigators dug into his personal laptop, which had been seized during a search of his home. What they found was a huge stash of messages between Christopher and a Canadian man named Steve. The two had met about 10 months before the tragedy on a social networking site, and they'd been in regular contact ever since. Christopher opened up to Steve about how unhappy he was in his marriage. He admitted he was tired of family life and dreamed of running away to the wilderness, far from everything. They even discussed survival skills, camping, and living off the grid in remote areas like forests, deserts, and mountains. At one point, Christopher tried to convince Steve to help him fake his death so he could escape his family, and so that Kimberly could collect the insurance. When Steve refused, Christopher said he would leave anyway, quitting his job and city life to disappear into the Canadian wilderness, where no one would be able to find him. Interestingly, about a month before the tragedy, Christopher started mentioning a woman named Maya. He claimed he was in love with her and planned to take her with him when he made his escape. Police tracked down Maya, and it turned out she was a dancer at a local strip club that Christopher regularly visited. The two had dated for a few months, and during that time, Christopher often complained about his unhappy family life. He even suggested they run away together, but Maya thought the idea was ridiculous and turned him down. To make matters worse, it also came out that Christopher had been involved with another young dancer. He had lied to her, claiming he was single and childless, trying to impress her in an attempt to start a new life. Christopher even spent a significant amount of money and even proposed they run away to another country together. With all these new revelations, Christopher could no longer escape the mounting evidence, especially with his defense team now drastically changed. The trial of Christopher Vaughn began in the fall of 2012 and quickly became a media sensation. During the proceedings, damning evidence came to light. Christopher had bought a gun just before the tragic event and had been practicing at shooting ranges multiple times, including the night before the family trip. Forensic experts confirmed that the bullet wound on Christopher's thigh was inflicted at nearly point-blank range, which directly contradicted his claim that Kimberly shot him while he was outside the car and she was inside. Another pivotal piece of evidence came from the bloodstains found on Christopher's clothing. Prosecutors argued that if Christopher had truly exited the car before any violence occurred, there would be no way for his wife's or children's blood to have ended up on his clothes. Even more damning, Kimberly's blood wasn't found on the murder weapon or on her hands, something that would have been impossible if she had shot herself in the head. Instead, investigators discovered a drop of Christopher's blood on Kimberly's thumb, suggesting she had been in close contact with him after he was injured. Further investigations into Christopher's work computer revealed even more incriminating evidence. He had researched detailed methods for staging a crime scene. This discovery painted a clear picture, further implicating him in the brutal murders of his wife and children. Kimberly's physician also played a critical role in the trial, providing testimony that Kimberly, despite being prescribed medication for insomnia, headaches, and high blood pressure, had never shown any signs of desire to harm herself or others. Even with the defense's attempts to counter the evidence, the jury ultimately found Christopher Vaughn guilty on all counts, convicting him for the horrific murders of his entire family. Christopher Vaughn was sentenced to 4 life sentences, one for each of his family members, without the possibility of parole. However, shortly after receiving this harsh sentence, Vaughn made a surprising statement. He claimed that he suddenly remembered the events of that tragic day in great detail and that he had never actually lost his memory. According to his new account, the gunshots rang out after he exited the car. Initially, he was confused about what was happening, but then he saw the bodies of his children. At that moment, he said his wife shot him in the leg, shouting that everything was his fault before turning the gun on herself. This new testimony was dismissed as absurd and had no impact on the verdict. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Christopher's parents continued to fight to clear his name in the court of public opinion. For years, they appeared on talk shows, gave interviews, and maintained blogs and social media accounts where they portrayed their son as a victim of an unhappy marriage. They also blamed Kimberly's family, insisting that her relatives never accepted Christopher and made his life miserable from the very beginning. The Vaughn family filed multiple petitions for clemency, hoping to have Christopher acquitted or his sentence reduced. Several of these petitions were addressed to the state governor, who, after reviewing the case, declared that he had no reason to doubt the fairness of the court's decision. The governor emphasized that the murder of one's own family is one of the most heinous crimes imaginable, and in this case, there would be no leniency or justification. With all that being said, do you think Christopher is the killer? According to official reports, the shot in his thigh was just an inch away from his genitals, which could have been a life-threatening blow. But then there's the fact that he seemed to want to escape to the wilderness without his wife, which could definitely be seen as a potential motive. To add to that, while in prison, Christopher allegedly wrote a 140-page notebook about his life. Yet he didn't mention anything about his wife or kids. Instead, he focused on his relationships with other women, which seems pretty bizarre, right? What are your thoughts on this? Drop a comment below. If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you once again for watching.